A Mafia boss was eating dinner alone when a breaking news segment stopped him cold. Grayson Voss sat at the head of a 14-seat table on the top floor of a glass tower above Lake Michigan. One chair filled, 13 empty, the silence echoing off marble that had never known a home-cooked meal. At 37, he ran the Voss Syndicate, the way his father had taught him: cold, precise, untouchable. To the world, he was Thorn Harbor Holdings, real estate and shipping worth hundreds of millions. Underneath, he was something the world only whispered about. He didn't watch the news. The television just filled a room too big and too quiet. But then the camera cut to a frozen sidewalk in Chicago, and something on that screen made a man who hadn't cried in 20 years feel his eyes sting. A young mother stood on the curb in a thin jacket, no gloves against the February wind. Her 2 little girls, twins, no older than 6, clinging to her coat. Behind them, everything they owned sat piled against a row of garbage bins. Their clothes were torn. One child clutched a drawing of a house, and it wasn't the mother's tears that froze him. It wasn't the children shivering. It wasn't the neighbors watching in silence. It was the address on the screen, 2200 Halstead Street, because that building belonged to him. Grayson had never once walked the halls of a property he owned, never met a tenant, never asked if the heat worked or the locks held. That's what systems were for. That's what men like Garrett Finch were for. But as he stared at Delaney Kowalski and her daughters standing in the cold outside his building, a question his father had beaten out of him at 12 clawed its way back up his throat. Who did this? And what he was about to uncover inside his own empire: a rent payment erased on purpose, a secret buried with his father, and a betrayal wearing the face of his most trusted man, would shatter everything he believed about the man he'd become. Because some doors, once you open them, can't ever be closed again. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's step back into that quiet penthouse, where one man is about to make a choice that'll burn his whole world down, or finally set it right. I am a Vietnamese to English translation specialist. Grayson pressed the power button, and the screen sank into darkness, but the image refused to disappear with it. The penthouse fell into the kind of silence only spaces too vast could create. He stared blankly out at the city lights, the remnants of the broadcast still burning behind his eyelids. He sat motionless for a long time, the salmon cooling slowly on the plate before him, the $90 glass of wine still half full. The world knew him through Thorn Harbor Holdings, a real estate and maritime corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars, owner of warehouse rows along the Chicago River, apartment buildings scattered across the city, and shipping contracts that moved through the ports day and night. That was the clean face, the one praised in the financial press, the one investors trusted when they shook his hand. But beneath that polished shell lay the Voss Syndicate, a name people dared speak only in whispers behind closed doors. Tied to money laundered through dozens of shell companies, loans charged at ruinous interest, and docks where cargo passed through without anyone daring to ask what was inside. Grayson ruled both worlds with the same cold hand, and by the same principle his father had carved into his bones when he was still too young to resist. People fell into 2 categories, assets or liabilities, and a good kingpin knew how to classify them quickly, and never confused one for the other. He'd never set foot inside any building he owned. He didn't need to. Those places belonged to numbers on reports, to automated systems that collected rent, calculated late fees, and issued eviction notices without a single human face becoming involved. Above all, they belonged to Garrett Finch. Garrett had stood beside the Voss family since Grayson's father was alive, a seasoned man with a calm smile and eyes that never revealed a thing, a man who knew how to make a problem disappear before Grayson even heard it existed. If a building needed to be emptied of tenants, Garrett handled it. If a city inspector asked too many questions, Garrett handled it. If a debt had to be collected through methods that never appeared in any ledger, Garrett handled that too. For 20 years, since his father first handed him the reins of the property division, Grayson had trained himself not to ask how Garrett accomplished those things. Because the answer had never mattered as much as the result, and the result was always perfect. The figures were always beautiful. The profit margins were always strong. It was the only language he'd ever been taught to understand, and he'd spoken it so fluently that he'd forgotten other languages existed. Yet tonight, for the first time in years, The numbers were no longer enough. He rose and walked to the broad glass window, looking down at the city, glittering beneath his feet like a colossal circuit board. Somewhere below, several miles south of where he stood, there was a building bearing the address he'd just seen, 2200 Halsted Street, a building he owned but had never laid eyes on, and inside his mind one question kept repeating, a question a man like him should never have allowed himself to ask. What had really happened there? He picked up his phone, his thumb sliding toward Garrett's name in his contacts, then stopped. An instinct he couldn't name told him not to call, not yet, not to let anyone know he'd seen it, that he cared, that he'd begun to wonder. He placed the phone on the cold stone tabletop, and in the immense silence of the penthouse, he realized his heart was beating with a strange rhythm he hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't the rhythm of a kingpin. It was the rhythm of something he'd believed had died inside him when he was 12 years old. That strange rhythm pulled him backward, to a January morning 25 years earlier, a morning so cold that breath seemed to freeze the instant it left the lips. Grayson was 12 then, sitting in the front passenger seat of his father's black car, both hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat as he watched the streets of South Chicago slide past the window. Conrad Voss drove in silence, and to a 12-year-old boy, his father's silence was the heaviest thing in the world. They stopped in front of a faded red brick apartment building, its ground floor windows boarded over, its cracked front steps sealed beneath ice. His father told him to get out and follow and said nothing more. Inside, the hallway smelled of damp rot mixed with old food, and the only ceiling light flickered as though it were nearing the end of its life. They climbed the stairs, the railing trembling beneath Grayson's small hand, and by the time they reached the second floor, he heard crying. A woman stood in an open doorway, holding a baby against her hip, while behind her 2 older children sat on black garbage bags stuffed with clothing. The woman was crying very softly, the way someone cried after screaming herself empty and realizing no one was coming. The cry of a person who had surrendered to what was happening. 2 men in heavy coats were carrying furniture into the hallway, and neither of them looked the woman in the eyes. Grayson stopped cold. He stared at the scene, then looked up at his father, and the question escaped his mouth before he could think. A small, trembling question filled with the innocent belief that adults could always fix what was broken. "Dad, can we help them?" Conrad didn't slow down. He placed one hand on his son's shoulder, heavy and warm, then kept walking toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. "You feel sorry for them," he said, his voice low and calm enough to chill the blood. "Good. That means you're still human. Now learn how to stop. Compassion doesn't pay debts. She hasn't paid rent in 3 months. The story ends there." Grayson looked back one last time. The baby on the woman's hip was chewing on the zipper of a coat far too thin for winter, and for half a second, the mother's eyes met those of the 12-year-old boy. There was no blame in that look, no pleading, only a weariness so complete it seemed to reach beyond the body itself. Then his father's hand tightened on his shoulder and turned him away, and they disappeared around the corner of the hallway. The boy he was that year didn't know the moment would haunt him, but not in the way people usually imagine. It didn't keep him awake at night or make him cry beneath the covers. It did something worse. It taught him exactly what his father meant to teach. Stop feeling, start counting. Build walls between yourself and the consequences of every decision. Then never allow anyone to convince you those walls were wrong. For the rest of his youth and into his adulthood, every time some human part of him threatened to rise at the sight of another person's pain, he heard that voice again, low and certain, echoing somewhere between the walls of his mind, reminding him that emotion was a luxury a man like him couldn't afford. When his father eventually passed away from a stroke 5 years ago, Grayson took absolute control of the syndicate. He didn't mourn by slowing down. He mourned by accelerating, doubling the entire empire in 3 years, completely automating the operations his father left behind, turning every family into a line of data and every eviction into a click. He had built an empire designed to ensure he would never have to see the people living inside it. Yet standing there now in the silent penthouse, looking down at the city glittering beneath his feet, Grayson realized his father's voice wasn't as loud tonight as it usually was. Another voice was trying to rise beneath it, weak but stubborn, the voice of the 12-year-old boy who had once asked a question he had spent his entire life trying to bury. And for the first time in 25 years, He wasn't sure he wanted to stop anymore. He didn't sleep. Near midnight, Grayson finally abandoned the pretense, left the bedroom, and walked into the study, where 3 computer screens glowed in the darkness, like windows opening into the empire he had built. He logged into Thorn Harbor's property management system, something he opened only once each quarter to glance over the aggregate figures, and for the first time in his life, he typed a specific address into the search field. 2200 Halsted Street. The screen loaded a page of dry records, and his eyes began moving down the lines of data, like a man reading the map of his own house, only to find every hallway unfamiliar. The building contained 42 apartments, had been acquired by Thorn Harbor 6 years earlier, and sat within a portfolio operated by a third-party management company under Garrett's supervision. The reported occupancy rate was 94%, revenue was steady, and maintenance costs were admirably low. 3 months ago, that final number would have pleased him. Tonight, it made him pause. Maintenance costs that low for a red brick building, more than 60 years old, in the middle of a Chicago winter, when furnaces had to run day and night and pipes could burst without warning, didn't suggest efficiency. They suggested that nothing was being repaired at all. He scrolled down to the tenant history, and his heart faltered for another beat. Over the past 18 months, the building had recorded 11 evictions, a number abnormally high compared with similar properties in the portfolio, and every one of them had been processed through the same automated procedure, the same form, the same law firm. Not one phone call, not one negotiation, not one face. He expanded the revenue table and noticed something stranger still. Despite losing 11 households, despite allowing the building to deteriorate, the appraised value of the land had been adjusted upward in the most recent quarter, accompanied by a brief internal note he had to read 3 times before he was certain he hadn't misunderstood it. Potential redevelopment pending review. Grayson leaned back in his chair, the cold light from the screen washing over his face. Something here didn't fit, and he had spent his entire career learning to recognize when a set of figures was lying. A building deliberately left to rot, its residents pushed out one household at a time, while the land beneath it rose in value, wasn't inefficiency. It was a pattern, a strategy, and a strategy always had someone behind it. He was about to type Garrett's name into the approval log search field, then stopped again, held back by the same instinct that had kept him from making the call earlier that night. If he began opening records inside the system, there would be a trail, and someone might notice that the owner, a man who had never cared about a single building in 20 years, had suddenly begun examining every line connected to 2200 Halsted Street. He shut off the screen. In the returning darkness, only the city lights filtered through the glass, and he sat there for a long time, one hand tapping softly against the arm of the chair as he wrestled with a thought he himself found absurd. For 20 years, he had never set foot inside a building he owned. He had never looked a tenant in the eyes, never asked whether the heat worked or whether the locks were secure. That was the entire philosophy his father had taught him. Keep your distance. Let the system handle the dirty work. Never allow consequences to wear a human face. But tonight, that face had appeared on his television screen, and now the numbers in the file were whispering that the story he had been told wasn't the whole truth. He stood before he could change his mind. Tomorrow morning, he wouldn't call Garrett. He wouldn't ask anyone a single question. He would go there himself. For the first time in his life, Grayson Voss decided to see one of his buildings with his own eyes, and some part of him knew that once he crossed that doorway, something would never return to the way it had been. The next morning, Grayson did something no one in his organization could have imagined. He took off his tailored suit, pulled an old gray wool coat from the back of his closet, and raised the hood. He drove an unmarked car toward the south side alone, but he wasn't reckless. A silent signal had already been sent to Elio, his most trusted driver, to trail him from a 2-block distance with a discreet security detail. He wanted to see the building exactly as it was, not as it would become if the owner announced a visit, and everything was suddenly repainted overnight. When he parked in front of 2200 Halsted Street, the reality before him was harsher than even the numbers he had seen on the screen the night before. The red brick building stood there like a sickened body, its walls blotched with damp stains, its fire escapes eaten through with dark red rust, several upper windows covered with cardboard and tape. A thin layer of ice coated the front steps, and no one had bothered to spread salt. He entered the hallway, and a blast of cold struck his face at once, nearly as bitter as the air outside. The cold of a building whose heating system had surrendered long ago. The smell of mildew mingled with peeling paint, and the faint, sickly sweetness of water, left standing too long, and in that instant, the memory of the hallway from when he was 12 returned so vividly that he had to stop and brace one hand against the wall. The same smell, the same dying yellow light overhead. He walked along the first-floor corridor, listening to the steady drip of water somewhere above, and stopped before a door left slightly open, where an old radio was playing through a veil of static. He knocked. The woman who answered was small and elderly, her silver hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck. Two sweaters layered over one another, beneath a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her pale blue eyes narrowed at him through the opening, with the wariness of someone who had learned that strangers rarely brought anything good. Her name was Mrs. Halloran. She was 71 years old, and she had lived in that apartment for nearly 30 years, since the building had belonged to another owner, a man who, according to her, used to come himself whenever a faucet leaked. Grayson lied with practiced ease, telling her he was from the insurance company, and had come to inspect the condition of the property. And Mrs. Halloran, perhaps because no one had listened to her in far too long, opened the door wider and invited him inside. The apartment was even colder than the hallway. The heater against the wall was completely dead, and when he touched it, the metal was cold as stone. Mrs. Halloran told him it had stopped working before Christmas, that she had called the maintenance number no fewer than a dozen times, and that each time an automated voice promised someone would come, but no one ever did. She pointed to the corner of the living room ceiling, where a brown stain spread like the map of some distant continent, water seeping slowly into a plastic bucket already waiting on the floor. She told him she slept in the kitchen because it was the warmest place in the apartment, warmed only by the oven she left slightly open all night, even though she knew it was dangerous, because she had no other choice. Grayson stood in the middle of that frozen room, the icy feel of the metal still lingering in his hand, and the number from the report the night before echoed through his mind. Admirably low maintenance costs. Now he understood what the true price of that number was measured in. It was measured in a 71-year-old woman sleeping beside an open oven, so she wouldn't freeze to death inside the very apartment, whose rent she still struggled to pay in full every month. He thought of his wine cellar filled with more than 200 bottles, of the pristine marble kitchen, and the sheer emptiness of his sprawling penthouse, and for the first time in his life, all that wealth made him feel sick. Before he left, Mrs. Halloran caught his wrist with a thin, trembling hand and asked whether he could help, not her, but the young mother upstairs who had been forced out the week before with her 2 little girls, a decent woman who had never cheated anyone out of a single cent. Grayson only nodded and stepped back into the hall, but the name she had just spoken followed him all the way home, and he knew he would have to find that woman. It took 2 days and several discreet calls to temporary shelters across Chicago's South Side before Grayson found where Delaney Kowalski was staying with her 2 children. It was a shelter housed in the renovated basement of an old church, where bunk beds stood packed closely together and the smell of weak coffee mingled with bleach. Once again, he wore the gray wool coat. Once again, he left his bodyguards at home, and when he descended the steps, he recognized her immediately, even though it was the first time he had ever seen her in person. She sat beside a folding table, her hair tied back in haste, dark circles beneath her eyes from lack of sleep, filling out a stack of job applications with a ballpoint pen balanced on her lap because there was no other surface available. Beside her, her 6-year-old twin daughters bent over a single sheet of paper. He watched as Piper became completely absorbed in her drawing, while her sister, Willa, carefully arranged colored pencils into neat rows in rainbow order, frowning with grave concentration, as though she were performing a task of great importance. Grayson introduced himself as someone from the company that owned the building, and told her he had come to help. Delaney looked up at him, and there was none of the gratitude in her eyes that he was accustomed to seeing in people receiving a favor, only the caution of someone who had been betrayed by the system too many times to trust unexpected kindness. He took out a thick envelope, placed it on the table, and said there was enough inside for her to rent a decent place for several months, a form of compensation for the trouble she had endured. She looked at the envelope as though it were some unfamiliar creature, then pushed it back toward him, slowly but firmly. She told him she didn't need his pity. She said that for the past 2 years she had worked 3 jobs at once, that she had paid the rent on time every month, even during weeks, when the 3 of them survived on noodles and bread, that she had never asked anyone for a single dollar and had no intention of starting today. Then she looked directly into his eyes and said the words that left him silent. What she needed wasn't money. What she needed was the answer to a question. She needed to know who had taken her children's home away from them. Because she had paid. She was certain she had paid. Yet the notice taped to her door claimed she owed 3 months of rent, and when she carried her receipts to the management office, they callously pointed to fabricated late penalties and administrative fees newly added to her file, twisted numbers designed to swallow her real payments and make her look like a debtor on paper. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't cry. But that very calmness made every word cut like a knife. She asked him how a woman who had paid every month in full could become a debtor overnight, how an entire system could speak with one voice and insist she was wrong, while she stood there holding proof in her hands. Grayson couldn't answer because he didn't know, and for the first time in his life, he felt ashamed that he didn't know what was happening inside the empire he himself controlled. While he was still trying to find the words, Piper slipped down from her chair, walked around the table, and looked up at him with the fearless curiosity only a child could possess. She held out the picture she had just drawn, the same square house with the sun and the heavily darkened doorknob. She told him it was the house she wanted to live in, a house with a door that could be locked so no one could come inside and take her mother's things again. From behind her, Willa added in a matter-of-fact voice that a real home had to be warm, not cold like the old place, and that innocent remark drove deeper into Grayson's chest than any accusation could have. He looked at the house drawn in crayon, at the door with its knob darkened by the full force of a 6-year-old child's longing, and thought of his own doors secured by fingerprint locks and surveillance cameras, doors he had never once feared anyone might tear from his grasp. He lifted the envelope from the table, slipped it back into his pocket, and spoke to Delaney in a voice unlike his usual one, a voice that sounded unfamiliar even to him. He told her he would find the answer, not because he pitied her, because she had the right to know, and as he climbed the stairs and left that basement behind, Grayson knew the promise he had just made would lead him into a place his father had warned him never to enter. Delaney's insistence that she had paid haunted Grayson through the night, and the following morning he didn't log into Thorn Harbor's primary system again, because he now understood that anything displayed on the surface might already have been altered. Instead, he called someone he trusted outside the property management machinery, a quiet technology specialist who had spent years helping the Voss family erase electronic traces, and gave him one instruction: trace the money connected to the apartment registered under Delaney Kowalski's name at 2200 Halsted Street, not through the management portal, but directly through the original records of the payment bank. Grayson waited in his study as his coffee slowly went cold, and when the results arrived in the early afternoon, he read them 3 times in succession to make certain he wasn't imagining what he saw. Delaney had paid. She had paid in full, on time, every single month, through an automatic withdrawal from her bank account, and each transaction had left a clear trail in the receiving bank's system. The money had left her account and reached its destination. The problem wasn't that she hadn't paid. The problem was that, after the money arrived, someone had entered the building's internal management system and erased those payment records, turning an exemplary tenant into someone 3 months behind with only a few keystrokes. Grayson sat motionless before the screen, and the chill running down his spine had nothing to do with the room. It came from what the data was revealing. This wasn't a software error. A system failure would have been random, would have generated error messages, would have affected several accounts at once in some senseless pattern. This had been deliberate, precise to the point of cruelty, aimed only at the exact records necessary to create a perfect legal justification for eviction. The specialist had found another detail that made Grayson's blood turn even colder. The system had been manipulated by a malicious automated script, deployed through a high-level administrator account granted only to the inner circle of the organization. The protocol was hard-coded to execute quietly in the dead of night, automatically diverting payments and wiping history logs, while leaving the surface interface untouched. It was a phantom subroutine designed so that when tenants like Delaney arrived with their receipts to complain, the system itself would brand them as liars without leaving a human fingerprint. Grayson remembered the cutting calm in her face when she asked how a woman who had paid every dollar could become a debtor overnight, and now he had the answer, an answer more horrifying than anything she had suspected. She hadn't been mistaken, she hadn't lied. Someone had deliberately made her look like a liar. And that meant the 11 evictions recorded over 18 months in that building might not have involved 11 irresponsible families at all, but 11 chosen targets. He rose and began pacing through the study, his mind racing as the pieces slowly locked into place. A building deliberately left to rot. Tenants driven out one household at a time through fabricated causes. The value of the land rising beside a note about redevelopment. This wasn't the negligence of a lazy management company. It was a plan, constructed coldly and methodically by someone inside his own organization. And Delaney had merely happened to be one name on a list marked for removal. Grayson stopped before the glass wall and looked down at the city. And for the first time he felt an emotion his empire had never been meant to allow anywhere near him. Anger. Not the anger of a kingpin whose interests had been threatened, but the anger of a man who had just realized that the system he had spent years building, so he would never have to look at anyone, had been quietly crushing real human beings. And he had never known. He didn't yet know who had been behind that administrator account at 2 o'clock in the morning. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would find out, no matter how close to him the name at the end of that road might be. Grayson couldn't sleep with that question hanging over him, so he did what he did best. He followed the money. If someone was emptying a building, not because it was losing money, but because the land beneath it would be worth more once it stood vacant, then the motive had to lie in what that land was about to become. He spent the next 2 days digging through layers of records he had never before bothered to examine, through Thorn Harbor subsidiaries buried deep within the ownership structure, and little by little, a picture far larger than the fate of one single mother began to emerge. The building at 2200 Halsted Street didn't stand alone. It was part of a row of 4 adjoining buildings along the street, and all 4 were controlled through the same chain of shell companies. All 4 showed the same pattern, maintenance costs reduced to almost nothing, eviction orders rising sharply, tenants disappearing month by month. Someone wasn't clearing out a single building. They were clearing an entire neighborhood, and when Grayson discovered why, he understood at once why the plan had been hidden so carefully. The entire stretch of land had been folded into a massive redevelopment proposal. A commercial and luxury residential complex worth hundreds of millions of dollars, financed through a network of foreign investors, whose names all led to dead ends on paper. With eyes trained to see through layers of financial disguise, Grayson recognized its true nature immediately. This wasn't merely a real estate deal. It was an enormous money laundering machine. Dirty money from underground operations would be pumped into the project under the name of development capital, passed through inflated construction contracts, then emerge on the other side as clean, legal, untraceable real estate profit. For that machine to function, they needed the land, and the land had to be empty. Every family still holding on inside those 4 buildings was a legal obstacle, a name on a lease that could delay demolition, prolong proceedings, and attract attention. So they were being removed, not with bullets or crude threats that would leave obvious traces, but with a weapon far quieter and far more ruthless, Thorn Harbor's own administrative machinery. Leave a furnace broken long enough, and people would abandon the place themselves. Erase a few payment records, and the courts would evict them legally without anyone bothering to investigate. Every person forced into the street was reduced to a line of optimized expense, an obstruction eliminated with efficiency. Grayson sat before a tangled diagram of arrows and company names, and with a sickly feeling rising in his throat, he realized that Delaney Kowalski had never been the true target. She wasn't anyone's enemy. She possessed nothing worth attacking her for. She had simply been a name in the wrong place at the wrong time, a life that happened to stand in the path of hundreds of millions of dollars. And the machinery had crushed through her exactly as it had been designed to crush through anyone, without hatred, without hesitation, only efficiency. That indifference was what made him shudder, because it was so familiar. It was the very philosophy he had worshipped for 20 years. People were assets or liabilities. And now he was watching that philosophy carried to the final end of its logic, turning living, breathing human beings into waste that needed to be cleared away. But one question still throbbed beneath everything else. An operation of this scale, this intricate, required access to the deepest levels of the organization. It required the person behind it to control both the legal machinery and the underground side of the empire at the same time. Very few people possessed that kind of power. Grayson counted the names on his fingers, and with each one he eliminated, his stomach tightened further, because the shorter the list became, the more clearly it pointed in a direction he didn't want to face. Before following the direction he didn't want to face, Grayson decided to learn more about the woman at the center of everything, partly because he needed to know whether she truly was nothing more than the accidental victim he had believed her to be. He asked his specialist to reconstruct Delaney Kowalski's entire history, and when the documents arrived, one detail stopped him cold halfway through. Before she became a mother working 3 jobs to support 2 children in a temporary shelter, Delaney had been a nurse. Years earlier, long before the girls were born, she had still been very young, newly entered into the profession, working for a home care company that served wealthy clients along the lakefront, and one of the final patients assigned to her care, during the months when he lay bedridden before his death, carried a name Grayson read again and again until the letters seemed to blur before his eyes. Conrad Voss, his father, the woman his empire had just crushed, the mother who had stood trembling on the sidewalk in that evening news report, was the same woman who had sat beside his father's bed during his final hours. The woman who had held Conrad Voss's fading hand while he, the only son, was busy somewhere else with numbers. Grayson remained motionless for a long time, trying to piece together a coincidence his instincts told him wasn't a coincidence at all. He didn't believe in fate or invisible threads, but he believed in the iron law of the world he inhabited, that when the same name appeared twice in 2 stories that seemed unrelated, there was always a connection someone was trying to hide. He dug deeper into how a promising young nurse had fallen so far, and the story that emerged troubled him even more. Not long after Conrad died, Delaney had been pulled into a professional scandal. She was accused of falsifying medical records and stealing medication from a patient. Allegations serious enough for the licensing board to revoke her credentials permanently, slamming shut every door to the career she had worked so hard to build. But when Grayson examined the case closely, with the suspicion sharpened by 20 years in a world of carefully manufactured lies, he began to see the cracks. The evidence against her was strangely thin, resting almost entirely on the testimony of a single witness who disappeared without a trace immediately after the hearing. The incriminating documents appeared at exactly the right time, were filed through every proper channel, and were so clean they became suspicious, exactly like the way her payment records would be erased at 2 o'clock in the morning years later. The same hand, the same method. Turn an innocent person into someone who looked guilty through perfectly forged paperwork, then let the system destroy them legally. Grayson leaned back, his heart pounding, and a chilling thought began to take shape. If the scandal from years ago had also been staged, then the targeting of her building years later might not have been accidental after all. Despite the conclusion he had only just reached, perhaps Delaney had never been merely anonymous collateral damage. Perhaps someone had been watching her for a very long time, had destroyed her once, and was now trying to erase her a second time. But why? What could a young nurse possibly possess that would make someone strike at her twice, years apart, with that kind of patience and cruelty? The only answer he could imagine left his throat dry. She had been with his father during his final days. She had seen something, heard something, learned something inside that room that no one was ever supposed to know. Grayson didn't know what it was, but he knew the woman who had pushed the envelope of money back toward him and said she wanted only the truth might be carrying a truth far larger than she herself understood, a truth connected to his father's death, and someone was willing to do anything to keep it buried forever, While Grayson was piecing together the fragments of Delaney's past, someone else was also making her way toward her, but from an entirely different direction. Inspector Russo, 39 years old, had spent nearly 4 years of her life pursuing the Voss syndicate without ever once reaching its core. She was the kind of police officer who was never loud, never theatrical, only persistent to a degree that could become frightening. A woman who kept inside her desk drawer a board covered with names and arrows, all of them leading upward until they stopped at Grayson Voss, always missing one final link that would close the chain. When Delaney's eviction appeared on television and Russo traced the building back to Thorn Harbor's ownership network, her investigative instincts stirred. She came to the shelter in the church basement one afternoon, sat across from Delaney at the folding table, and spoke to her not as a potential witness, but as a human being. Russo told her that she knew Delaney had paid, knew she had been forced into the street unjustly, and believed that behind what had happened stood an entire organization she had been pursuing for years. Then she placed on the table what she truly wanted. She needed Delaney to come forward as a witness, to provide testimony and anything else she knew, so Russo could build a case strong enough to bring down the Voss empire from its roots. Delaney sat in silence for a long time, and in that moment she felt trapped between forces she had never wanted any part of. On one side was the inspector offering her a chance to reclaim justice, but accepting it would also mean making herself a target for some of the most dangerous people in the city. On the other side was the man in the gray wool coat who had introduced himself as someone from the company that owned the building, the man who had promised to find the truth for her. And now, through Russo's carefully chosen hints about the Voss family, Delaney was beginning to suspect he might be part of the very organization that had destroyed her life. And between all of it, carrying the greatest weight, were her 2 6-year-old daughters sitting only a few yards away. Piper and Willa now fast asleep on a worn bunk bed, exhausted from the long, uncertain days, 2 small lives whom every choice she made might place in danger. Delaney asked Russo a direct question. If she agreed, who would protect her children when people powerful enough to erase even her bank records decided she had become a threat? Russo didn't lie to her. She admitted that witness protection wasn't perfect, that some people had fallen before they ever reached the courtroom, that she couldn't promise absolute safety and could promise only that she would fight with everything she had. That naked honesty, instead of frightening Delaney into running, made her trust Russo more than all the polished promises she had ever heard. But trust didn't mean agreement. She had learned the bitter lesson that in this world, people could tear her life apart with only a few lines on a page, that justice was a luxury reserved for those powerful enough to stand behind it, while a homeless, unemployed single mother was nothing more than a piece on a board for both sides to fight over. She told Russo she needed time to think, and the inspector, understanding that pressure would only make everything collapse, nodded and left behind a business card with her private number, and a sentence Delaney would remember for a long time. She hadn't come there to use Delaney as a tool. She had come because she believed no one deserved to be crushed that way, without someone standing on their side. After Russo left, Delaney remained in the cold basement, gripping the card tightly in one hand, her eyes fixed on her 2 daughters, and for the first time since she had been forced into the street, she felt a new kind of fear. Not the fear of losing a home, but the fear that no matter which road she chose, the people in the shadows would always remain one step ahead of her. A few days later, Grayson returned to the shelter, this time carrying not an envelope but practical things, thick blankets, warm food, and pairs of wool gloves for the 2 children, which he set down awkwardly on the table, like a man who had never learned how to give, without attaching a transaction to it. Delaney looked at him with the same guarded expression, now layered with a new suspicion after her conversation with Russo. She asked him directly who he really was, why an ordinary employee of the management company had personally come looking for her twice, driven his own car, brought no one with him, and why he cared this much about what had happened to her when an entire enormous system had already decided she wasn't worth caring about. Grayson couldn't tell her the truth, not yet, so he only said he was trying to correct a wrong his company had caused, and that she had every right not to trust him. That refusal to deny her doubts, that admission that she had reason to be suspicious, unsettled Delaney. because every liar she had ever known had tried to erase all uncertainty, while this man simply allowed hers to remain. While the two adults stood inside that hesitant tension, Piper slipped down from her chair again and came toward him holding a new sheet of paper. She remembered him, remembered the tall, quiet man who had looked at her drawing the last time longer than anyone ever had. This time she had drawn another version of her dream home, but now beside the heavily colored doorknob, she had added 3 small figures holding hands, and one larger figure standing slightly apart. She pointed to the figure standing alone, and told him it was him, that she had drawn him guarding the door, so no one could take her family's home away again. Grayson held the picture, and something inside his chest, something that had remained frozen for 25 years since that cold hallway when he was 12, cracked ever so slightly. No one had ever drawn him as a protector. In his world, people imagined him, when they imagined him at all, as a shadow to fear, a name to whisper in the dark. Yet this 6-year-old child, with only a few strokes of crayon, had placed into his hands an image of the man he had never dared believe he could become. He looked up and caught Delaney watching her daughter, and in that moment her defenses loosened, revealing the exhaustion beneath them and the longing to trust someone again that she had always kept hidden. She began to speak, not entirely to him, but almost as though she were speaking to herself, saying that the hardest part wasn't the cold or the hunger, but the look in her daughter's eyes when they asked when they could go home, and she had no answer to give them. She told him that there had once been a time when she was a nurse, when she had cared for dying people with all the devotion she possessed, when she had believed that if she lived with kindness, the world would answer her with kindness in return, until the day everything was torn from her hands and she never understood why. Grayson listened, and he knew more than she imagined. He knew the day her life collapsed had probably been arranged by someone. He knew the woman sitting before him might be carrying a fragment of truth about his own father. But he said nothing. He remained silent, and that silence was partly meant to protect her from a danger she couldn't yet imagine, and partly a form of deceit that made him despise himself. He realized he was being drawn toward this woman and her 2 children in a dangerous way, toward a closeness his father would have called a fatal weakness, and some part of him, the part trained his entire life to keep its distance, screamed at him to retreat before it was too late. But when he looked down at the picture in his hands, at the larger figure standing guard by the door, he knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Before he left, he gave Delaney a second promise, quietly but with certainty, that whether she trusted him or not, he wouldn't allow anyone to touch her or her children ever again, and he could only pray that he was strong enough to keep it. But in Grayson's world, no action remained invisible, and the questions he had begun asking in secret were already creating echoes. Garrett Finch hadn't risen to his position through innocence. For years he had planted silent alerts throughout the system, invisible tripwires that would tremble whenever anyone touched the files he wanted kept hidden. So when the account belonging to the technology specialist Grayson had hired began tracing Delaney's payments, when someone started reopening the layered ownership records of the 4 buildings on Halsted Street, Garrett knew. He didn't immediately know it was Grayson, but he was clever enough to follow every trace backward, and what he discovered first chilled him, then hardened his resolve. The boss himself, the man Garrett had served across 2 generations, the man who had never once cared about a single individual building, was suddenly tearing open the very machine Garrett had spent years perfecting. For another man, that discovery might have marked the end. For Garrett, it was simply the signal to strike first. He understood that if Grayson had begun caring about the people inside those buildings, then the Grayson he had always known, cold, precise, unburdened, was dead, and a new Grayson was taking shape, one with a softened heart, and in their world, softness meant death. Garrett began moving with the methodical discipline that had kept him alive for 3 decades in the shadows. First, he planted whispers. In private meetings with the lower-ranking leaders, the men who controlled the docks, the pipelines, and the money, he hinted that Grayson had changed, that the boss was spending his time lingering around a temporary shelter, protecting an anonymous tenant, allowing emotion to influence decisions that should have remained cold as steel. He didn't need to make a direct accusation. He only needed to plant the seed of doubt, because in an organization built on fear and self-interest, Nothing spread faster than the thought that the man at the top had grown weak. Then he began tightening the string Grayson still believed were firmly in his own hands. Several streams of money were suddenly delayed for vague technical reasons. A number of important meetings were rescheduled, and doors that had always stood open now closed with cold politeness. Grayson's technology specialist abruptly stopped answering his phone, and when Grayson sent someone to find him, the man had already left the city, abandoning an empty apartment with all the signs of someone who had received a warning persuasive enough to send him running. Piece by piece, Garrett was stripping Grayson of his tools, his allies, and his resources, isolating his own boss inside the empire that bore his family's name, turning Grayson's absolute power into a shell that grew emptier by the day. But Garrett made one mistake. He underestimated his opponent. Grayson recognized the isolation almost immediately, because he too had been raised in that same world, and he too knew how to read the signs of a coup taking shape. He noticed the unnatural silence in phone calls, the new hesitation in the eyes of the men beneath him, and he understood that someone was slowly clipping his wings. Instead of panicking, he became colder than ever. He stopped using every channel controlled by the organization, turned to old methods of communication that couldn't be traced, and relied only on the handful of people whose loyalty he knew with certainty. Among them Elio, the quiet driver who had stood beside him for years and had never wavered. With a clarity cold enough to cut, Grayson realized that the investigation into Delaney had become a war for survival, that the person behind everything didn't merely want to empty a neighborhood, but was now prepared to eliminate him as well. And as he sat alone in the darkened penthouse without turning on a single light, listening to the immense silence he knew so well, a bitter truth slowly came into focus. The traitor wasn't an outsider. The only person powerful enough to do all of this, the only person who understood him well enough to isolate him with such precision, had to be the one who had stood beside his family longer than anyone else, the man he had trusted, almost as though he were a second father. And that thought hurt him more deeply than any knife ever could. With Garrett's name now standing clearly in his mind, Grayson returned to the question that had haunted him for days. Why had a nurse who once cared for his father been destroyed twice? And he realized the answer wasn't buried in financial records. It was inside the very room where Conrad Voss had drawn his final breath. He needed to hear it from the only person still alive who could tell him. He went to Delaney one evening, and this time he hid nothing. He told her the truth about who he was, that he wasn't a management employee, that he was Grayson Voss, the son of the man she had once cared for, the owner of the empire that had crushed her. She stepped back, betrayal carved across her face, and for one moment he thought she would send him away forever. But he kept speaking. He told her about the 4 buildings, the money laundering operation, the erased records, the scandal from years earlier that he now believed had been manufactured, and finally he asked the question that had brought him there. During those final days beside his father's bed, what had she seen? Delaney remained silent for a long time, her hands clasped tightly together, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled as though she were opening a door she had kept locked for 5 years. She told him that during Conrad's final weeks, his health had been weak but stable. He had remained lucid, still able to talk, and his medical readings suggested he could have lived for several more months. Then one night, the family's trusted man, someone whose face she knew but whose name she didn't, came to visit and asked to be left alone with the old man. She said she had stepped outside as instructed, but because she was concerned for her patient, she returned sooner than expected, and through the partially open door, she saw the man handling Conrad's medication line, doing something no ordinary visitor had any reason to do. She told him that Conrad's condition worsened suddenly and inexplicably that night, and only a few hours later he died, his death attributed to natural complications of age and illness. She had suspected something. She had intended to speak, but she was only a young nurse whom no one had enough reason to believe, and before she could act, the scandal descended upon her, stripping away her license, her reputation, and even her voice. At the time, she had believed it was simply terrible luck. Now, sitting before the dead man's son, she finally understood the chilling truth. She had been destroyed because she had seen something she was never meant to see. Grayson sat motionless as the world spun around him. For 5 years, he had believed his father died from a stroke, A natural end, he had answered by throwing himself into work so he wouldn't have to face the pain. Now every piece fell into place with merciless precision. Garrett hadn't waited for Conrad to die naturally. He had hastened the death so he could seize control of the Empire's underground operations at the exact moment he wanted, while Grayson was still too consumed by numbers to suspect anything. And Delaney, the only witness, had been systematically erased from society. First through a scandal designed to ensure no one would believe her. Then years later, when chance placed her building inside the neighborhood clearing plan, Garrett must have recognized that she was still there, still a loose thread capable of unraveling everything, and this time he had intended to erase her permanently. Grayson looked at the woman before him, the woman who had carried the secret of his father's death in silence for 5 years, while paying for it with her entire life, and an anger cold as ice rose inside his chest. It was no longer the anger of a betrayed kingpin, but that of a son who had just learned his father was murdered by the man he trusted most. He took Delaney's trembling hand, and for the first time in his life, his voice broke as he whispered that he believed her, that she had never been insane, had never lied, and that he would make the man who had done this pay, no matter what price he himself had to bear. Grayson knew that the moment Delaney spoke, the truth was also the moment everything became twice as dangerous, because if Garrett had been willing to kill a kingpin to seize control, then eliminating a witness and a softened boss wouldn't give him a moment's hesitation. The first thing Grayson thought of wasn't himself, and it wasn't the evidence. It was the 2 children asleep in a bunk bed in the church basement. He called Elio that very night, and in a voice carrying an urgency the loyal driver had rarely heard, he ordered him to take Piper and Willa and their mother out of the shelter immediately, to a safe house beyond the city, known only to a handful of his most trusted people, a place with no connection to any property bearing the Voss name or Thorn Harbor. Elio arrived within an hour, silent and efficient, and Grayson watched as the 2 children were gently awakened, wrapped in the thick blankets he had once brought them, and carried to the car without understanding anything about the danger closing around them. Piper, still drowsy, managed to cling to her drawing of the house with the locking door, while Willa murmured a question about whether the place they were going would be warm, and the innocence of it tightened Grayson's heart. He crouched until he was level with their eyes and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage, telling them that Uncle Elio would take them somewhere warm and safe, somewhere with a heater that worked and doors that locked securely, and that their mother would join them soon. He deliberately created a peaceful story for them, turning the night journey into a small adventure, so that no shadow of the truth could touch the clear, innocent world they still inhabited. Only after the car carrying the 2 children disappeared, into the darkness, did Grayson finally breathe out, and he turned to Delaney to discuss what came next. Delaney had insisted on letting the car leave with her daughters first, whispering to Grayson that she needed to run back inside to retrieve a small bag containing her original rent receipts, the only physical proof she had left against Garrett. Grayson agreed to wait for her by the alley, but in that very moment, the cost of a single delay revealed itself. Garrett was always half a step ahead. He had placed men around the shelter from the moment whispers about Grayson's softness began to spread, and he knew the witness Grayson was protecting posed the greatest threat to his entire hidden empire. While Grayson was focused on getting the children away, Garrett's men had already moved into position. They didn't strike while the children were still there, not out of compassion, but from the cold calculation that any incident involving children would draw too much attention, and without knowing it, Grayson had protected Delaney's daughters at exactly the right moment by sending them away first. Knowing that Garrett would stop at nothing, Grayson quietly signaled Elio to take the primary security detail with him to guarantee the girls' safety, keeping only a few men by his side. But Garrett's trap had already been sprung. The moment Elio's car turned the corner, a fleet of black SUVs cut off the alley, completely isolating Grayson and Delaney before his remaining guards could react. Heavy shadows dissolved into a swarm of armed mercenaries appearing from both ends. The ambush erupted with calculated, overwhelming violence. Though Grayson fought back with the lethal instincts of a syndicate boss, he was heavily outnumbered by professional mercenaries striking from the shadows. In the brutal crossfire of blows, Grayson threw himself in front of Delaney, using his own body as a shield to protect her. A heavy, crushing strike caught him from his blind spot, sending him crashing onto the icy concrete as his vision fractured into darkness. Through the fading blur of consciousness, he could only watch helplessly as Delaney was dragged into a waiting vehicle. Her muffled screams cut short as the doors slammed. The mercenary raised a weapon to finish him, but the sudden, piercing wail of a distant police siren echoed down the block. Panicking, the men abandoned the unconscious boss, threw Delaney into the waiting vehicle, and the tires screeched into the night. Hours later, when Grayson finally forced himself upright, blood running from his temple, the alley was deathly quiet. There was only the wind moving through the garbage bins and Inspector Russo's business card, fallen from Delaney's coat pocket and lying on the wet ground. She had been taken. Garrett now possessed the only piece he truly needed, the woman who carried the truth about Conrad's death, and he would use her either to force out every remaining piece of evidence or to erase it forever. Grayson rose in the dark alley, closing his hand tightly around the business card, and through the sharp pain in his temple, only one thing remained clear in his mind. He was completely alone now, cut off from the very empire he had built, and he was about to make the choice that would define who he was for the rest of his life. Grayson dragged himself back to the penthouse through the night, the blood at his temple already dried into a dark streak, and he sat down in the familiar darkness of the enormous room, facing the heaviest choice of his life. The cold logic his father had spent 25 years forging inside him began to speak, and it spoke in Conrad's own voice, that low, certain voice that had always echoed between the walls of his mind whenever some human part of him threatened to rise. It told him to think like a kingpin. Delaney was only a tenant, a witness, a liability. If he tried to save her, he would have to openly turn against Garrett, break every unspoken rule that had kept the empire standing, make himself a traitor in the eyes of the entire organization, and most likely lose everything, his power, his fortune, perhaps even his life. But if he turned away, if he allowed her to disappear like so many names before hers, he could negotiate with Garrett, preserve the empire, and continue living in this penthouse as though none of it had ever happened. His father's voice repeated what it had told him in that frozen hallway when he was 12. That compassion didn't pay debts, that the moment he saw a human being instead of a contract was the moment he had already lost. For years, that voice had always won. But tonight, inside the immense silence, Grayson heard another voice, weaker but refusing to fade, the voice of the 12-year-old boy, who had looked back at the mother in the hallway and asked why they couldn't help her. That boy had never truly died. He had only been locked away behind the walls his father taught him to build, waiting for a quarter of a century. And now, when Grayson closed his eyes, he no longer saw ledgers or profit margins. He saw Piper's drawing, the house with the locking door and the yellow sun, the tall figure standing guard that she had said was him, the protector no one had ever believed he could become. He saw Delaney's calm, cutting gaze when she pushed the envelope back toward him and said she wanted only the truth. He saw her trembling hands as she told him about the night his father died, the burden she had carried alone for 5 years. And he understood something his father had never taught him, that the walls he had built had never protected him. They had only imprisoned him, turning him into a wealthy man living among 13 empty chairs, so lonely that silence had to echo back at him just to prove he still existed. His father had been wrong. Not wrong about the world being cruel, but wrong about what a person should do when faced with that cruelty. People weren't assets or liabilities. Delaney wasn't a line of expense. Piper and Willa weren't obstacles to be removed. They were human beings, and seeing their dignity wasn't the fatal weakness his father had always claimed it was. Perhaps it was the only thing that still made him worthy of being called human. Grayson opened his eyes, and for the first time in 25 years, his father's voice inside his head fell silent, not defeated but surpassed, replaced by a decision rising from the deepest place within him, a place he had believed dead for a very long time. He would save her. He would stand against Garrett, even if it burned down the entire empire 3 generations of the Voss family had built, even if it cost him everything he possessed. Because some things were worth more than an empire, and he had taken far too long to understand that. He rose, wiped the dried blood from his temple, and picked up the phone. He didn't call any leader in the organization. He didn't try to negotiate or weigh the losses against the gains. He dialed the number on the business card he had picked up from the wet alley, Inspector Russo's private number, the woman who had spent 4 years trying to bring him down. When her voice came through the line, alert and guarded despite the hour, Grayson drew a deep breath and spoke the words his father would have considered the ultimate betrayal. He said he was Grayson Voss, that he knew who had killed his father, that an innocent woman was being held captive at that very moment, and that he was prepared to give Russo everything she needed to drag the entire Voss empire into the light, in exchange for only one thing: help him save Delaney before it was too late. Grayson knew exactly where Garrett would take Delaney, an old warehouse buried deep inside Thorn Harbor's port district, a secluded place the organization had long used to settle matters that were never supposed to leave a trace. He also knew that if he went alone by the old rules, he would only be walking into his own death. So he did the one thing Garrett would never have expected. He worked with Russo, while she mobilized her officers to surround the port from the outer perimeter, waiting for the precise moment to move in with full legal authority. Grayson, Elio, and the handful of men who still remained loyal approached quietly from the water, along a route known only to someone who understood the harbor as intimately as he did. He carried not a weapon meant for slaughter, but something far more dangerous to Garrett: a hard drive containing every piece of evidence he had gathered, the laundering trails, the erased records, the plans to empty the neighborhood. Copies of everything had already been sent to Russo before Grayson ever set foot near the warehouse, ensuring that no matter what happened to him that night, the truth could never be buried again. Inside the freezing warehouse, Grayson found Delaney tied to a chair in the middle of the empty floor, and Garrett standing beside her, as calm as ever, the familiar smile never reaching his eyes. He didn't seem surprised when Grayson walked in. He only sighed like a disappointed teacher looking at a student who had failed to learn the lesson, and said he had hoped it wouldn't come to this. The confrontation between them didn't begin with fists, but with words, and those words cut more deeply than any blow could have. Garrett admitted everything with a composure that was almost inhuman. He said he had ended Conrad's life when the old man became an obstacle to his ambitions, that he had destroyed Delaney years earlier to silence the only witness, and that all of it had been business, nothing more than rational decisions made in a world with no room for softness. He looked at Grayson with something close to pity, and told him Conrad had been right about him from the beginning, that there had always been a fracture inside him, a seed of compassion that would eventually destroy him, and now it finally had. But Garrett made the last mistake of his life. He underestimated a man who no longer had anything left to lose. Grayson didn't rush forward in blind rage. He kept his voice cold and steady, stretching every second as long as he could, because he knew that with each one that passed, Russo was drawing closer. He told Garrett that he was right about one thing, that Grayson had changed, but wrong to believe that change was weakness. When Garrett's men moved toward him, a violent struggle erupted through the darkness of the warehouse, and Grayson fought not for power or pride, but for the woman tied to the chair and the 2 children waiting for their mother in a place of safety. In the middle of the chaos, he managed to cut Delaney free and push her toward the exit where Elio was waiting, shielding her with his own body. At the exact moment Garrett believed he still held the advantage, floodlights swept across the warehouse, turning the darkness white. A commanding voice thundered through loudspeakers, and Russo's officers poured in from every side. Garrett stood frozen inside the ring closing around him, and in that moment Grayson saw on the face of the man who had betrayed his family not fear, but the collapse of someone who had just realized the entire empire of shadows he had spent years stealing had crumbled into dust. Russo placed the handcuffs on Garrett herself and read him his rights, and as he was led past Grayson, the 2 men looked at one another for the final time. Garrett asked quietly, almost with curiosity, whether everything Grayson had just surrendered had been worth it. Grayson turned toward Delaney, who stood trembling beneath the blanket Elio had placed around her shoulders, yet still held her head high, her eyes searching for him with a light no empire could ever buy. "Worth it," he answered, only 2 words, and they were the truest words he had ever spoken. The evidence was in Russo's hands. The murderer was in chains, and for the first time in 25 years, Grayson Voss stood with his back straight and heard no trace of his father's voice inside his mind, only the sound of his own heart beating, alive and free. In the weeks following the night at the warehouse, as prosecutors began peeling back each layer of the Voss empire beneath the light, something unexpected surfaced from the mountain of records Garrett had buried for years. Among the documents sealed inside the trader's private safe, investigators found a will, and it wasn't the will Grayson had read 5 years earlier after his father's death. This was an amended version, signed and notarized by Conrad Voss only a few weeks before he died, a document Grayson had never known existed. He sat alone in the attorney's office, holding the yellowed pages in his hands, and as he read, the understanding of the world he had only just begun to rebuild shifted beneath him once again. In that will, Conrad wrote in the familiar dry language of the law, but hidden beneath it was something he had never revealed throughout his entire life. He directed that a substantial portion of his fortune be used to establish a foundation, one devoted to helping the very families his empire had driven into the streets over the years, tenants who had been evicted, children who had grown up without the security of a stable home. Attached to the will was a brief handwritten letter, the script trembling beneath the hand of a man whose strength was fading, and in it, Conrad offered no elaborate apology. He wrote only that when a person drew close to death, numbers stopped meaning anything, and the faces he had chosen not to see throughout his life began returning to him. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, that he knew he had taught his son things that might have damaged him, and that if there was still one thing he could do right before leaving this world, it was to return a portion of what he had taken from people who had no voice. Grayson read the letter again and again, and something inside him broke apart and was mended at the same time. For 25 years, he had lived beneath the shadow of a father he believed was completely cold, a man with no room for compassion, and Grayson had spent his life trying to become the perfect version of that shadow. Now he understood that the truth was far more complicated. His father hadn't suddenly become a saint. He was still the man who had caused immeasurable suffering, who had taught Grayson to build walls, who had pulled him away from that hallway when he was 12. But at the end of his road, when death stood before him, even a man like Conrad Voss had looked back and seen what he had lost. Even he had tried, however late and imperfectly, to repair some part of the damage, and it was because of that will that his father had been killed. Garrett must have known about it. He must have realized that a Conrad whose heart was softening, who wanted to return his fortune, who might change the entire direction of the empire, was a direct threat to his ambitions. So he had acted before the amended will could take effect. He had killed Conrad, buried the new document, and allowed the old will to be executed as though the final wishes of the dying man had never existed. Delaney, the woman who witnessed what happened, became the last loose thread that had to be cut. Grayson placed the letter on the desk, and for the first time since the funeral, he wept, not only for what he had lost, but because he had just discovered a part of his father he had never known existed, a part that a traitor had stolen from both of them. He thought of the 12-year-old boy, who had once asked why they couldn't help the mother in the hallway, and he wondered whether that boy had inherited not his father's cruelty, but the hidden part Conrad himself hadn't dared allow to speak until the final moments of his life. Grayson knew what he had to do. He would finish what his father had never been given the chance to complete, not to absolve Conrad of his sins, but to finally choose the path both father and son should have taken a very long time ago. The price of Grayson's choice was anything but small, and he had never fooled himself into believing it would be. Garrett Finch was charged with a long list of crimes, from murder and money laundering to fraud and conspiracy, and with the mountain of evidence Grayson had handed over to Russo, there was no escape left for him. In the end, he received a sentence long enough to ensure he would die in prison. But that same evidence also exposed the entire dark side of the Voss empire, and Grayson knew that if he wanted to drag Garrett into the light, he couldn't pretend his own hands were clean. He chose to cooperate fully with the investigation, voluntarily surrendering records of the illegal operations in which he himself had been involved for years, even though doing so meant he would also have to face justice. He didn't escape punishment through some miracle, nor did he want to. Because of his cooperation, and because of the crucial role he played in bringing down a criminal organization the police had pursued for years, prosecutors agreed to a deal, a reduced sentence, but still a real sentence. Years he would have to serve for what he had done, and for everything he had chosen not to see. Grayson accepted it not with resignation, but with a strange sense of peace, because for the first time in his life, he felt he was living in service of something larger than himself. During the time before his sentence began, and throughout the years that followed, he set about dismantling the empire 3 generations of the Voss family had built. He cut away every underground branch, shut down the pipelines, ended the money laundering operations, and transferred every legitimate part of Thorn Harbor into a transparent structure under strict oversight. And from his father's amended will, he established what he named the Halstead Initiative, a foundation devoted entirely to helping families at risk of losing their homes, providing legal assistance to tenants facing unjust eviction, repairing buildings that had been allowed to decay, and stopping the very pattern of cruelty he had once helped sustain without ever looking closely enough to see it. The building at 2200 Halstead Street was the first property restored. The heating system was replaced. The ceilings were repaired. The windows covered with cardboard were fitted with clear glass once again, and Mrs. Halloran, who had once slept beside an open oven so she wouldn't freeze to death, now lived in a warm apartment with the promise that no one would ever force her into the street again. Delaney, after everything she had endured, was finally cleared of wrongdoing. When the truth about the manufactured scandal from years earlier came to light during the investigation, the licensing board was forced to reopen her case, and the name that had been stained for 5 years was finally made clean again. She regained her nursing license, her profession, and the dignity that had once been taken from her. But she didn't stop there. Carrying within her a deep understanding of the pain suffered by those crushed beneath systems too powerful to fight, she agreed to become an advisor to the Halstead Initiative. The person who built a bridge between the numbers on paper and the real human beings behind them, the one who made certain the foundation, never forgot that every file represented a life. Grayson and Delaney didn't rush to name the feeling growing between them, because they both understood that wounds like theirs needed time to heal, and that some things were too precious to be hurried. But on the afternoons when he visited the small, warm house she and her daughters now called home, when Piper came running out to show him a new drawing, and Willa told him about her day at school, Grayson felt something neither a wine cellar holding 200 bottles nor a 3-story penthouse had ever given him, the feeling of belonging somewhere. He knew the years ahead wouldn't be easy, that he still had a debt to pay before the law, that the road toward redemption was never short. But for the first time, he walked that road without hearing a voice inside him ordering him to stop. A long time later, after the debt to the law had finally been paid, and the prison walls were left behind, Grayson sat in the living room of the warm home he now shared with Delaney and the girls, looking out the window as the evening narrowed around them. The television was on again, tuned to the same news channel, with the same anchor, but the story had changed. A reporter stood in front of a red brick building on Chicago's South Side, but the building behind her was no longer the cold, haunted shell it had been that winter. The walls had been cleaned, the windows fitted with clear glass, the fire escape repainted, and in the small courtyard behind the building, children were playing, truly playing, running and shouting, with the careless joy children only allow themselves when they feel safe enough to make noise. The reporter was presenting a story about the Halstead Initiative, about families who had been able to keep their homes, about buildings once abandoned to decay that had now been brought back to life. Then the camera shifted to an interview, and on the screen stood a woman in a clean, professional nurse's uniform, her back straight, her eyes carrying the quiet steadiness of someone who had walked through the deepest reaches of loss and built something better on the other side. Delaney told the camera that no one deserved to lose a home simply because they stumbled for a moment, that the system wasn't broken, that it was functioning exactly as it had been designed to function, and that what needed to be done was to redesign it so it could see human beings. Grayson watched her in silence, watched the children in the courtyard, and for the first time, something inside his chest settled into the place where it had always belonged. He lifted the remote and turned off the screen, but this time he didn't shut off the television because the image was too painful to bear. He turned it off because for the first time in his life he was smiling. In the stillness of the room, he heard the sound of small footsteps, and Piper, a little taller now, but still clutching a notebook filled with houses, came running toward him. She tugged at his sleeve and told him that someone in her class might have to move away because the family was having trouble with their home, then looked up at him with eyes that had already seen too much, but had chosen to trust anyway, and asked whether he could help. Grayson bent until he was level with her, and that innocent question echoed across 25 years, reaching the 12-year-old boy who had once stood in a frozen hallway and asked his father the very same thing. But this time, the answer was different. "Tell me about your friend," he said, "and then we'll figure out what to do." And as he spoke those words, he knew the final circle had closed, not through the coldness his father had once taught him, but through the very compassion Conrad had spent a lifetime trying to bury, and had only managed to reclaim at the very end. The story you have just heard is fictional, and none of its characters are real, but the pain it speaks of is more real than ever. Every year in the United States, millions of eviction filings are made, millions of people are forced from their homes, and behind every dry number is a family, a mother, a child holding a picture of the house they dream of living in. We often say someone lost their home as though they simply misplaced it somewhere, but the truth is that they didn't lose it. Unfeeling systems took it from their hands while the rest of us simply changed the channel. The greatest lesson this story hopes to leave behind is that human beings are never only numbers on a spreadsheet, never merely assets or liabilities, and choosing to see the dignity of another person, especially someone at their most vulnerable, has never been a weakness. It is one of the noblest things that makes us truly human. Sometimes a single decision made by one person in one moment can spread farther than anyone imagines, far enough to reach a courtyard where children finally feel safe enough to laugh and play. If you or someone you know is at risk of losing a home, remember that, in the United States, you can call 211, a service that connects people with housing resources, emergency rental assistance, and free legal support, because no one should have to face that struggle alone. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that together we can continue listening each day to more meaningful and compelling stories. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, what it brought to mind about the life around you, and whether you have ever met someone who needed another person to truly see them and listen. Please leave a comment and share what is in your heart, because we sincerely want to hear every one of your stories. Thank you for staying with us until the very final moments. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health and a life filled with joy and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.